Welcome to my budget deck channel where I try to make decks as cheap and playable as possible, and Blue Eyes was in dire need of this because you can see on the right hand side most of these cards, if they're not options that I would include in this deck, then most of the cards you see on the right hand side are cards that people would play in a normal Blue Eyes version, and you can see they're basically all ultra rares and super rares. So I really wanted to create a version of Blue Eyes that would appeal to maybe people that just started playing the game, that maybe that people that want to feel a bit like Kaiba and just got into Master Duel because they liked the anime back then and now really want to be playing this kind of deck, but they don't know if they want to spend all their materials yet. And yes, wait with spending all your materials on blue, as possibly maybe you'll eventually discover new decks that you prefer to play, and don't go all in on the very first deck you see. Plus, this deck kind of teaches you nearly every mechanic in the game, at least a tiny bit, without making it too complicated to understand, too complicated to grasp. Plus, it's kind of a control style deck, so it forces you to interact with your opponent. It forces you to read their cards and actually think about what you're doing when you're doing it, and it makes you be better at the game. Yes, it's not like an easy grind, best deck to Platinum 1, Diamond 1 now deck kind of profile, but it's a very fairly playable deck that actually can do quite well in like the gold, low platinum area, and will definitely cause for some funny or cool moments with playing this deck. So starting off with triple Blue Eyes White Dragon, obviously you want to run 3 of this card. Even though you don't run stuff like Trade In, I feel like 3 is still fine because you have so many ways of summoning this card out, especially from the deck, so you do want to run it at 3. Plus, if you start with it in your opening hand, it's not all bad because you can actually discard it with all of your discard traps. So in the end, it could be worse. You can start with 2 because you get 2 for free if you like, and then just craft the last one if you really feel like you need a third one. After playing a few games with this deck, I did feel like I needed a third one, so I did get myself one. But you can start with the 2 free ones that you get from the Dragon deck, and then keep on grinding possibly till you can afford or want to get a third one, or even feel like you need one. Next up, 1 White Stone of Legends is also a good card in the deck if you run Blue Eyes at 3, because then the effect actually does stuff and gives you some hand advantage, which can come in handy for stuff like your discard traps. And it is important for one of your draw cards, and basically the only draw card, which is Cards of Consonance. I did opt for this card over the stuff like Trade In or Pot of Desires, because I feel like Pot of Desires can be quite disruptive with this sort of deck, because you might banish stuff that you don't want to banish, especially if your deck basically goes around the Blue Eyes kind of cards. And since it's a budget deck, you only run certain cards at lower ratios, so Pot of Desires would work instead if you want to rather go for it, but Cards of Consonance is actually fine because you have multiple ways of searching your stones, which another one is the White Stone of Ancient. Triple Maiden with Eyes of Blue. I know in a very competitive version you wouldn't play this card at least anymore. Back in the days you might have, but nowadays it is a bit too slow, it's a bit too disruptible. It does stuff, but it doesn't do it overly well, but it can still put your opponent in a pickle if you annoyed him enough with trap cards beforehand, so they cannot just run over this card. Also, you can trigger it with a lot of cards in your deck and summon Blue Eyes out and then go into your synchro plays. So this is not all bad at all, and I would recommend running 3 in this specific variant. 1 Protector with Eyes of Blue. You could run multiple if you want to go into more rank 1 kind of plays. Other than that, this card doesn't do all that much. Yes, you can have a Blue Eyes in hand from time to time. It's not that hard to have one. The double summon isn't really that helpful because you kind of don't want to empty all your hand into the field because you have discard effects, and this card doesn't really have anything else to do with it. But it's a good enough card and you want to max out on the level 1s, so you would run it at 1. Cards that you could run instead of it, for example, is Effect Veiler, because it's a spellcaster, light monster that has a tuner, which you can search with the Sage with Eyes of Blue. It doesn't even have to be a spellcaster, but it just is like the other cards. Sage with Eyes of Blue is one of the, well, I don't want to say playmakers, but it's a very key card in the deck because it gains your hand advantage, and it also searches your White Stone with this. Also, it can get out Blue Eyes, which will be important for certain cards in your deck. Master with Eyes of Blue, don't have to run it at 3, but actually also adds cards back from your graveyard that you discarded, so you can keep your discard engine going, which is quite nice. Also, it can summon out Blue Eyes from the graveyard, which isn't terrible either, but you have to attribute one of your effect monsters on board, which can be problematic because you see you don't run that many monsters that you always have one, but I'll be talking about this in a second as well. Whitestone of Ancients is one of your big playmakers. Get it to the graveyard by normal summoning it and then go into one of your link monsters. That's how you get into touch with the link mechanic, which you will be using Salamangreat Almirage because it's a link 1, so you can basically just use it for this card. Or you could run Link Karibo. They have different kind of things that they do. You kind of would want to run both just to have multiple ways of doing this over and over again. This card is good because you can redo it from the graveyard and send cards back to your graveyard from your field. This card can actually trigger your Maiden with its effect, which is quite funny sometimes. So I decided to opt for this card because I had it, but both cards do work fine. I decided to go for this card then at 2, because if you don't run Link Karibo and the grind game goes on a bit, you still have a card that you can like send to the graveyard, basically your stones in a later turn if you want to, or even your Master with Eyes of Blue. Yeah, it's that. This counts as an effect monster, so technically you can then tribute it, so it does at least its job, but you can only do the main phase 2, which is a bit annoying, but you will have to deal with this in a budget version. 1 Dragon Spirit of Wide, good spell trap card removal. It can come back from the graveyard as well because it's always treated as a blue eyes card, especially Maiden that summons from everywhere, which is really nice. Helps a lot with this one as well. Sadly, you can only run it at once, but 1 is usually quite alright. Blue Eyes Solid Dragon, actually a very solid card because it can negate one of your opponent's monster's effects, and that is permanent, not just to the end of the turn. And this card can just dip from the battlefield, shuffle itself back into the deck, and you can just do the whole effect multiple times with your stones, with your Maiden, and so on. So this is actually a very helpful card, and another reason why you possibly want to have 3 blue eyes, so that you have enough in deck to actually leave the battlefield again and redo all of this and dodge possible removal. Cards of Consonance, a draw spell, getting rid of your stones, which is kills 2 birds with 1 stone, if you want to say it like this. That's basically all it does, but that is good enough. We're after a card that can't be missed in a deck that runs that many normal summons that are level 1, helps you search out your stone or helps you search out your Sage with Eyes of Blue, and from there on you can go into your blue eyes. So this card is quite nice. Comes at a price of 2000 damage, sadly, because you don't really have another way of normal summoning the card afterwards. It is what it is. Sometimes you need to pay the price for doing cool things. 1 card that I decided to run in this deck because it's actually not all that bad unless you play the mirror match. If you play against blue eyes, then this card will be very annoying to deal with. Other than that, it's okay. It's okay. You can search one of the stones from your deck, which is quite nice if you have Cards of Consonance in your hand, and a lot of the time you can either get Sage with Eyes of Blue or one of your stones, which both of them help you get out blue eyes. If you have another level 1 in hand, at least Sage does, then this card still does its job. At 2 it's fine, you could cut it if you want to run other cards, but I feel like this card is quite funny and it does help the deck. Double Torrential Tribute, because sometimes you don't really have a board, and if your opponent then keeps on going, you want to make sure that they end their turn as well. Triple Phoenix Wingwind Blast, a card that is basically a Raigeki break, but it shuffles, well, places on top of the deck, which for extra deck monsters is obviously a bit better than for other kind of ones. If you shuffle stuff like Alistair back to the top, they can just do it again. For certain play starters, this would be bad, but a lot of the time this card is still good. Plus you can target 1 card your opponent controls, doesn't have to be face up, and doesn't have to be a monster, so you can basically get rid of everything, but sadly only for a turn. But you can stack cards on top of your opponent's deck, which makes them draw into it again, so they don't draw a combo piece, which can also be helpful from time to time. Another card, Paleozoic Dynamiscus, also one of the discard traps, gets rid of stuff and summons itself out from the graveyard, which can be quite nice to finish games, especially since you run quite a trap heavy deck. The good thing with all these discard traps is you can banish this card from your graveyard and add 1 blue eyes monster back to from your graveyard to your hand. So you basically don't run out of discard fodder for quite some time, I would say. Next up, the ultimate creature is of destruction, I think it's called, is 1 card that protects your blue eyes, and if your opponent runs into it, then their creature goes away. That's what it is. but unaffected by card effects is very, very, very strong. Plus this card sets itself back from the graveyard one time if you summon Blue Eyes White Dragon. This card, funny enough, also works on your Synchro monster and works on Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon. Not the set it back effect, but the protection effect. So this card can be very, very neat to keep one of your massive dragons on board. Divine Wrath, another card that stops your opponents in their tracks while discarding the card and possibly passing off of this one. And Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi, I've already hinted at Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, but you do not see an actually fusion card in here. This is the reason why, because you can summon it off of Fists of the Unrivaled Tenyi if this card gets destroyed, which happens from time to time because every opponent seems to have Harpy's Feather Duster turn 1, even though it's at 1. Doesn't matter, they all have it, so this card can actually help you with this. Other than that, your Blue Eyes monster is, well, Blue Eyes White Dragon is a normal monster, so you, therefore non-effect monster, so you can actually negate some stuff that your opponent is doing, which is quite nice against graveyard monster effects or spell trap card effects that can really screw you up. For the extra deck, you run one of this, simply because you can summon it out with the trap card. But you could technically run one Dragon's Mirror if you really want to. Fusion Summons from Grave could go into Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon in the grind game, but it probably would be a waste of crafting material. Asia Silver Dragon at 1, could run it at 2 if you really like to. Usually don't have to, but this card does work quite well in a Blue Eyes deck. Protects your dragons from targeting and destruction, which is quite neat. Gigantic Castle is a card that if you need a monster that has more than 3000 attack, but this one would have exactly 3100. You can summon it, and if your opponent is playing Blue Eyes, this might give you the edge over them if they don't have skill drain up. Giant Castle, Cloud Castle is basically the opposite card, very defensive, but it could summon you your Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon, for example, back out of the graveyard, which can be very nice. Could go into rank 9s, but didn't include any because that doesn't really come up in this variant at all. For the Xyz monsters, they're not really key in this deck, but you can use a few of them. This card is a stall card. If you happen to start with your Protector and one other level 1, you could go into this one, detach then during your opponent's turn, and maybe if you had your Stone, for example, then you can, during their end phase, summon out one of your Blue Eyes. Also, your opponent hardly can get rid of this card because it's unaffected by other cards' effects and cannot be destroyed by battle after its effect, so it would stall at least one turn. Not overly great, but for a rare and in a level 1 deck, that card is worth running at 1. Dragluon is basically here for fodder for Draglubion, both basically the same name but very different cards. It doesn't do all that much, but if you're playing against an opponent's dragon deck, this card can come in handy from time to time. Not great. What is great is Hearth Earth Dragon and its final form. Both of them do very different things, but they can actually be quite helpful. Not most of the time, but sometimes. Then we have Pain Gainer and the Seven Sins. You can use them on top of Draglubion if you didn't use its effect that turn. So these cards are fine, but you don't really have to know all that much about them. Read them one time and your game will tell you if you can summon them. Yeah, that's what you need to know. They can be quite neat in certain situations, but aren't game changers. Could run Zeus, obviously, but that is just another card that is very expensive and might get banned eventually, so maybe don't invest into that too much. One card that is a bit of a game changer in this deck because it can finish games very, very quickly is Numeron Dragon. Summon it off of Draglubion. Very good as a game finisher, if you like. And another card that is at least worth mentioning is Black Rose Moonlight Dragon, because you can summon it off of the effect of Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon. Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon in this deck at 1 is actually fine because you can shuffle it back into your deck with the White Stone of Ancients, which can be quite neat. Other cards to mention are probably God Dragon Cataclysm. Could play the card. It's quite some removal. You have to tribute a dragon but pop 2 cards. It's nice if you have the White Stone, for example, and then you could tribute this to pop cards, but you also have loads of other dragons in your deck, so this card makes sense, but I decided not to run it because sometimes you couldn't get it off and other cards were just a bit better than that. Nebula Dragon, a card that you could run at 1 or 2 in this deck because you will have Blue Eyes in your hand at one point. This card then pushes for a rank 8, and if it's in your hand and you discard it, it's not completely useless either, but since I don't run the whole trade-in kind of thing and I felt like the tramp cards were a bit better, I decided not to go for it, but it wouldn't hurt running at 1 or 2. Skill Drain, a card that everybody plays, wouldn't be that great in this kind of deck, but You obviously can go for a more competitive variant, and Maxi in basically every Blue Eyes deck this card would be great because you don't do much. This variant is very good against hand traps because Maxi doesn't hurt you in the slightest actually. Like your opponent maybe draws 1, maximum 2 cards, but that is about it. But you would be drawn a lot of cards if you actually hit your opponent. Problem is you don't draw into any other hand traps because you would have to pair it with stuff like Nibiru, maybe with stuff like Ash Blossom, Effect Veiler, so we actually draw into outs to your opponent's board, so it's actually scary, but most of people won't take the challenge, so technically it can be a turn ender anyway. Another card to mention gets this stuff to the graveyard, Forbidden Droplet, very good card in general if you like. Could run True Light. I felt like it was a bit bricky when I tried it out. You can't search it, at least not in this variant, so it didn't do all that much. Hope you enjoyed the deck profile. That is basically all. I will be uploading some gameplay. There have been some interesting games, interesting matches that I want to show off, and leave a like, comment, subscribe if you want to be nice. Do these things that the YouTubers tell you to do, but most importantly, hope you have a good day.